Life stories. The shocking courtroom moment that ruined a corporate empire. They thought he was just another guy, another nobody who didn't stand a chance. Dismissed, ignored, and treated like a fool. But by the end of the day, he had exposed a major legal fraud right in front of the judge. The courtroom had already made up its mind before he even spoke. Marcus Holloway stood tall, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie a little crooked, but his posture unshaken. He wasn't a lawyer, he never claimed to be. He was just a man who wasn't going to let a ruthless corporation take his late mother's home. And he was going to fight for it, no matter how outmatched he seemed. Judge Samuel Pierce peered over his spectacles, his lips twitching in a barely contained smirk as he took in the sight of Marcus. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Holloway, representing yourself, I see?" The words were laced with amusement. Marcus didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor." A low chuckle rose from the opposing side. Olivia Winters, the corporate attorney, adjusted her designer glasses and made no effort to hide her satisfaction. She had wiped out countless small-time defendants like Marcus without even breaking a sweat. This wasn't a case. This was a warm-up, a joke. Under her breath, she muttered to her assistant, "This will be over before lunch." Her assistant smiled knowingly. Marcus caught the comment. That was the point. He was supposed to hear it. But he just stood there, his face calm. He'd been written off before, underestimated. But that only made him more dangerous. And that's why he was here today. Judge Pierce exhaled slowly, flipping through his notes. "So, this is a property dispute, is it? A foreclosure challenge?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. It's my mother's house." The judge barely glanced at him. "And you think you can argue this case against Miss Winters, a seasoned attorney?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I don't think, Your Honor. I know." A few snickers came from the corporate side. Some of the jurors shifted uncomfortably, but there was something else too. The room fell a little quieter. That kind of silence comes when someone who's supposed to fail refuses to back down. Judge Pierce shook his head. "Very well, let's get this over with." But Marcus wasn't here just to argue. He was here to win, and they had no idea what he had in store. Across the aisle, Olivia Winters sat, cool and composed. She was in her element. The courtroom was her domain. The rules, the strategy, it was all second nature to her. She'd beaten dozens of small-time defendants like Marcus Holloway. This wasn't a case, it was a formality. Judge Pierce sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Miss Winters, you may proceed with your opening statement." Olivia rose, smooth and practiced. She adjusted her blazer as she stepped toward the jury. Her voice was confident, cutting through the room like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is quite simple." She didn't even look at Marcus as she gestured in his direction. "We have a man here who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was lawfully seized by my client through a proper foreclosure process. The law is clear, the facts irrefutable. This isn't about feelings, it's about deadlines, obligations, and legal contracts. My client followed the law. Mr. Holloway did not." A deliberate pause. She shrugged casually. "I understand that losing a home is painful, but pain does not change legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." With a calm nod to the judge, she returned to her seat, hands folded, already certain that the case was hers. Marcus stayed still, his expression unwavering. This was exactly what he expected. But when he stood to speak, he caught the judge leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly thinking this was a waste of his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice steady, "Miss Winters is right about one thing. The law is clear." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But the question is, did my client follow it?" A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom, some of the jurors leaning forward. The corporate side tensed. Marcus continued, "I've spent the last 6 months reading every case, every statute, every loophole the banks use to strip families of their homes. And I found something." Olivia's face twitched in irritation. She let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, this should be good." Marcus didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to request an official discovery process because I believe the plaintiff is hiding something." The room shifted. Judge Pierce sat up straighter, his earlier amusement replaced by curiosity. "Hiding what, Mr. Holloway?" Marcus locked eyes with Olivia. "Fraud." The word hung in the air like a weight, sinking into the room. For the first time, the laughter died. Olivia's confident smirk faltered. The judge gave Marcus a sharp look. "Fraud?" His voice carried a note of skepticism, but there was something else, something like curiosity. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my mother's house was based on forged documents, and I can prove it if I'm allowed to request full discovery." The room shifted. Judge Pierce sat up straighter, his earlier amusement replaced by curiosity. "Hiding what, Mr. Holloway?" Marcus locked eyes with Olivia. "Fraud." The word hung in the air like a weight, sinking into the room. For the first time, the laughter died. Olivia's confident smirk faltered. The judge gave Marcus a sharp look. "Fraud?" His voice carried a note of skepticism, but there was something else, something like curiosity. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my mother's house was based on forged documents, and I can prove it if I'm allowed to request full discovery." Olivia's face hardened. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to delay the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure procedures." Marcus tilted his head, walking forward a step. "Standard? Tell me, Miss Winters, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have 2 different signatures from the same person?" The room stirred. The jurors exchanged glances, and murmurs broke out from the gallery. Olivia's face darkened. "What are you talking about?" Marcus pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement from his file. He walked over to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. "These are 2 separate copies of the same document, Your Honor," he said. "One from the initial filing and one from a later modification. If you look closely at the signatures, you'll see they don't match." Judge Pierce leaned in, studying the papers closely. Marcus continued, his voice calm but steady. "Now, I'm no expert, but I know my mother's signature, and that second one, it's not hers." The judge flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed as he scanned the signatures. For the first time, his expression shifted from dismissive to focused. He glanced up at Olivia. "Miss Winters, do you have an explanation for this?" Olivia cleared her throat, her composure cracking. "Your Honor, this is just an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time." Marcus didn't let up. "Maybe, but that second signature was on a document filed just 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side," he pointed to the papers in the judge's hands, "you'll see that they're completely different. The second one was signed the day after my mother was hospitalized for a stroke." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Even the jury leaned in. Judge Pierce turned back to Olivia, his voice now firm. "Miss Winters, does your client have the original signed documents on file?" Olivia hesitated. A brief moment of silence passed before she stammered, We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor." Marcus smiled, cool and collected. "That's fine. I'll wait." The room was thick with tension now. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just intrigue anymore. It was doubt. Judge Pierce flipped through the documents again, his fingers tapping the bench rhythmically. The confidence that had once filled the courtroom now hung in the air like a heavy fog. Olivia, who had been so sure of her victory just moments ago, was now on the defensive. Olivia's posture stiffened, her confidence cracking. She opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't done. He pressed on, his voice steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, if the signatures are forged, that means the foreclosure process is built on false premises, but that's not all." He pulled another document from his folder, handing it over to the bailiff. This mortgage wasn't just transferred once, it was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender. The room fell quiet. The jurors leaned forward, trying to make sense of the new twist. Marcus continued, walking slowly toward the judge's bench, his every step deliberate. "I've looked through the transfer paperwork," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the judge, "and every time this loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an official endorsement, a signature from the previous lender confirming the transfer. But there's something missing." Olivia's gaze hardened as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Judge Pierce raised an eyebrow, flipping through the transfer papers. He scanned them closely, his expression growing more serious by the second. "There's no endorsement on the final transfer," Marcus said, his voice quiet but forceful. The judge's jaw tightened as he read through the papers again. He looked up at Olivia. "Ms. Winters, do you care to explain why this final transfer has no signature?" Olivia's face paled. She was flustered now, her earlier smugness vanishing. This must be a mistake," she muttered, barely making eye contact with the judge. Marcus pressed forward. "It's not a mistake, Your Honor. This means the lender that foreclosed on my mother's house never actually owned the loan. The final transfer was never legally completed. They had no right to foreclose in the first place." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the tension thick in the air. Even the judge seemed to pause for a moment, considering the weight of the new evidence. The courtroom wasn't just watching, they were waiting. Olivia's hands trembled as she tried to regain control of the situation. Her usual confidence had been replaced by frustration. She stood up quickly, trying to salvage her composure. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant is merely grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the law. That's all that matters." But Marcus was unshaken. He let her words hang in the air before speaking again. "Followed the law? You're saying that the law was followed when my mother's mortgage was transferred 3 times without the proper paperwork? When signatures were forged and critical endorsements were left out?" Marcus let out a small breath, shaking his head. "If that's following the law, then I don't know what's legal anymore." The judge tapped his gavel lightly on the bench, his face hardening. "Mr. Holloway, you're making some serious claims. Do you have any more evidence to support this?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I do, Your Honor, but there's more. I want to talk about the original lender, the one who sold the loan in the first place. Who were they?" Olivia shifted again, clearly caught off guard. "What does that matter?" Marcus turned to the judge. "It matters because, Your Honor, the company that originally held the loan is notorious for fraudulent practices. They've been involved in multiple foreclosure cases just like this one, where they sold off loans without proper endorsements, without completing the legal transfer process. And my mother's case isn't an isolated incident." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jury leaned forward, eyes wide. Olivia's face drained of color as Marcus handed over yet another document, which the bailiff quickly passed to the judge. "Here is the evidence, Your Honor," Marcus said. "Records of other homes that were foreclosed under these same circumstances. All of them were acquired by the same company, using incomplete or forged paperwork." Judge Pierce skimmed the new documents, his face growing darker with each page. He set them down on his desk, his eyes flicking between Marcus and Olivia. This doesn't look good, Miss Winters," he said, his voice quieter now. Olivia sat back in her chair, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She looked like she was about to speak, but the judge cut her off before she could. "I'm not sure what you're going to say next, but I suggest you be prepared, because the evidence Mr. Holloway has presented paints a very different picture of this case," Judge Pierce said, his tone now stern and authoritative. Olivia's head snapped toward him, her usual composure slipping completely. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. These documents are not admissible." Marcus stayed calm, his voice low but steady. They're perfectly admissible, Your Honor. I've done everything by the book, and I believe the truth is right in front of us. There was a beat of silence in the courtroom. The tension had reached a breaking point. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze locking with the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness to the stand. Someone who can shed light on this whole situation. The person who notarized my mother's second mortgage modification, the one I believe was forged. A stunned silence followed. No one had expected this. Not the judge, not Olivia, and certainly not the jury. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. Marcus was about to bring someone forward who could blow the entire case wide open. Olivia stood up immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were not informed of this witness beforehand. This is a surprise. Marcus didn't flinch. I only tracked her down yesterday, Your Honor, and what she has to say changes everything. Judge Pierce studied Marcus for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll allow it, but Mr. Holloway, you better have the proof to back this up. Marcus didn't answer, but his face was calm, assured. The fight was far from over, but he could feel the shift in the room. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned toward the figure stepping into the room. It was Linda Myers, a notary public. She looked visibly nervous as she made her way to the witness stand, adjusting her glasses with trembling hands. Judge Pierce gave her a nod. State your full name and occupation for the record. Linda cleared her throat, her voice shaking slightly. Linda Myers, I'm a licensed notary public. Marcus stood up, his voice firm but gentle. Miss Myers, do you remember notarizing the second mortgage modification for my mother, Alma Holloway? Linda hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to Olivia. I do. Marcus leaned forward. Were you present when she signed the document? A long pause followed. Linda's fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand as her eyes darted around the room. Finally, she spoke. No, I wasn't. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's voice dropped, almost a whisper. Then how did the document get notarized? Linda's face turned pale. I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. They told me the document had already been signed and I just needed to stamp it. Another wave of shock hit the courtroom. Olivia sprang to her feet, shouting, "Objection, Your Honor! This is hearsay! She can't verify the legitimacy of the document!" Judge Pierce raised a hand to silence her. Overruled. Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you just said? Linda nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't know at the time, but I should have. The room was silent, the weight of her admission sinking in. Olivia sat down, her face a mask of frustration. She knew it was over. Marcus turned back to the judge. Given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing endorsements on the mortgage transfer, I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My mother's home was taken through fraudulent means, and now the evidence is clear. Judge Pierce exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel against the bench. Judge Pierce's gavel came down with a sharp crack. The room fell into complete silence, the weight of his next words hanging heavily in the air. After considering all the evidence presented today, I hereby rule in favor of the defendant, he said firmly, his voice carrying through the courtroom. The foreclosure on Alma Holloway's property is nullified. The property must be returned to her immediately. Marcus let out a slow, controlled breath. He hadn't realized until that moment just how tightly his chest had been wound. But now it was over. His mother's home, his family's home, was safe. The gavel's echo still lingered in the room as people shuffled in their seats, processing what they had just heard. The courtroom, which had been so skeptical of Marcus just hours ago, was now silent, and the mood had completely shifted. The corporate attamies, the ones who had been so confident earlier, now sat frozen, their expressions blank. Olivia's face had gone completely pale, her mouth set in a hard line as she stared down at the table, defeated. Marcus stood tall, his heart pounding with a quiet triumph. But this wasn't just about winning. This was about justice, not for him, but for his mother, for his family, and for all the people who had been wronged by the same system. As the courtroom began to stir with murmurs and quiet exchanges, Marcus turned to face Olivia one last time. The smug, arrogant attorney from earlier was now gone. In her place was someone who had been exposed, someone who had underestimated Marcus and had thought his case was nothing more than a formality. "Miss Winters," Marcus said softly, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to make her look up. "Next time you try to bulldoze someone out of their home, I suggest you make sure the paperwork is in order." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was undeniable, and Marcus had done the impossible. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps slow but purposeful, his mind still racing. He could feel the eyes of the people who had been watching him, the whispers of admiration floating in the air around him. Some of them had never thought a person like him would stand a chance against a corporation like the one he'd just beaten. But here he was, walking out of that courtroom victorious. As he reached the courthouse steps, he was greeted by a few reporters who had been waiting outside. Their cameras flashed and their microphones thrust toward him. "Mr. Holloway, how does it feel to win against a corporate giant like that?" one of them asked. Marcus smiled faintly, though it wasn't one of celebration. It was more like the smile of someone who had been through something far bigger than they'd expected. "It feels good," he said, his voice calm. "But it's not about me. It's about making sure people like my mom, like families everywhere, aren't taken advantage of by a system that doesn't care about them. This fight isn't over, but today was a step in the right direction." The reporters jotted down notes, their questions continuing to fly. But Marcus wasn't interested in the spotlight. He wasn't doing this for the cameras. He didn't need validation from strangers. He just wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else again. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice call out from behind him, "Mr. Holloway!" He stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. It was Judge Pierce, standing at the top of the courthouse steps. His posture was less imposing now, a slight shift in his demeanor, more respectful even. Marcus raised an eyebrow, unsure of what the judge wanted. "Can I help you, Your Honor?" he asked, his tone neutral but guarded. Judge Pierce's eyes met his, and for the first time, Marcus saw something other than the cold, professional distance that judges typically maintain. There was a small hint of something else, maybe curiosity, maybe respect. "You surprised me in there," the judge said, his voice softer than usual. "I'll admit, I didn't think you had what it took to pull this off, but you did." Marcus didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I don't think anyone expected this outcome, Your Honor." Judge Pierce looked at him for a long moment, as though measuring him. "You ever think about law school?" he asked, his voice almost casual. Marcus chuckled softly, the idea almost amusing. "Not really. I never thought I'd be in a courtroom like this." The judge's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Well, you've got a knack for it, I'll say that much. You've got a talent for making people squirm." Marcus shook his head, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "Law school's not in the cards for me. But thanks for the compliment, I guess." Judge Pierce didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and gave a small nod. "Just something to think about. You never know." With that, the judge turned and walked back toward the courthouse, his figure disappearing inside. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the sun warm on his face. The weight of everything that had happened today was still settling in. But now, more than anything, it felt real. The fight had been long and it had been hard, but it was worth it. A couple of people from the gallery were exiting the courthouse, and as they passed him, he overheard their quiet murmurs. "That guy should be a lawyer." "Never saw it coming. I thought he was just some random guy, but he took them down." Marcus didn't acknowledge them. He wasn't looking for accolades. He wasn't looking for anyone's approval. What mattered to him was that his mother's home was safe and that they'd won. He walked down the courthouse steps and into the street, his heart a little lighter than it had been when he'd walked in. His work wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today he'd made a difference, and that was enough. The fight for justice didn't end here. There would always be more battles, more cases to uncover, more people who needed someone to stand up for them. And Marcus Holloway, the man they all underestimated, was ready for whatever came next. Lessons learned. The story of Marcus Holloway is a powerful reminder that persistence, integrity, and a willingness to fight for what's right can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The central lesson here is that you should never be underestimated or dismissed based on your background, experience, or the assumptions others make about you. Marcus, a man with no formal legal training, didn't just win a case. He exposed a systemic injustice that others were too blind or unwilling to see. His victory wasn't just about reclaiming his mother's home. It was about standing up for truth, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The story also teaches that preparation and determination matter more than credentials. Marcus spent months meticulously studying the case, finding loopholes, and gathering evidence, proving that anyone can make a difference if they are willing to put in the hard work. Life, much like the courtroom, often requires you to challenge the status quo, ask tough questions, and believe in your ability to make change. In the end, it's not about winning in the traditional sense. It's about standing your ground when others doubt you and proving that persistence can alter the course of even the most difficult battles. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.